They had already decided she was guilty before the sun cleared the rooftops, and in towns like this, a decision made by many didn't need truth to stand upright. Before we go on, let me ask you something. What would you have done if you were there, standing in that dust, watching a girl with no voice against 100? The street in Red Hollow stretched barely 40 yards from the saloon to the general store, a strip of hard-packed earth baked under a rising Arizona sun, the kind of heat that pressed down on your shoulders before noon even thought about arriving. And right there in the center, where wagon tracks crossed like scars that never healed, she stood, or rather, she was made to stand, hands bound in front of her, dark hair tangled by the wind, her eyes steady in a way that didn't belong to someone. Surrounded on all sides, because the truth was, Ayanna Redbird had already accepted something the rest of them hadn't even begun to understand. Boots scraped against dirt, slow and restless, men shifting their weight like they were waiting for a show to start, not a judgment to be passed, and somewhere behind them, a wooden sign creaked on rusted chains, tapping a rhythm that sounded almost like a clock counting down to something nobody wanted to name out loud. No one spoke her language, and she didn't waste breath on theirs, because words had already failed long before they dragged her into the open, long before fingers pointed and voices rose, and someone said the only thing they needed to say, that she was Apache, and that was enough. A woman near the front held her shawl tight around her shoulders despite the heat, her lips pressed thin, eyes hard with something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite fear either, something older, something learned, something passed down without question. And beside her, a boy no older than 10 looked up at the girl in the dust, and then at his mother, like he was trying to understand how a person became something else just because everyone agreed she was. The sheriff stood off to the side, Brennan Cole, badge catching the light like it was trying to remind him what it meant, but his hand hovered near his belt without ever settling, his gaze drifting between the crowd and the girl as if searching for permission to do something he already knew he wouldn't do. And that was the quietest kind of betrayal, the kind that didn't need shouting or force, just the absence of action when it mattered most. A length of rope hung from the beam they dragged out from behind the feed store, not new, not old, just there, like it had always been waiting for a moment like this, and a man stepped forward to adjust it, his fingers careful, almost gentle, like he was fixing a loose strap on a saddle instead of preparing something no one would speak of later. And the dust shifted under his boots, rising in soft clouds that caught the light and turned the whole scene into something hazy, unreal, like a memory that hadn't happened yet, but would stay forever once it did. Ayanna's gaze moved once, slow, deliberate, not searching for help, not pleading, just observing, taking in faces one by one as if she were the one passing judgment, and for a second, just a second, someone in that crowd looked away first. The wind carried the scent of leather and dry wood and something faintly metallic from the far edge of town, and it threaded through the silence that stretched tighter with every passing heartbeat, until even the smallest sound felt too loud, a cough, a shuffle, the distant creak of a wagon somewhere beyond sight. Then came the sound that didn't belong to the rhythm of the crowd, steady, measured, hooves against packed earth, not hurried, not hesitant, just certain, and it rolled in from the far end of the street like something the town hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore, and one by one, heads turned, conversations died before they formed, and the boy at the front took a half-step back without knowing why. The rider didn't rush, didn't call out, didn't reach for anything at his side, just let the horse carry him forward through the thinning line of bodies, dust lifting around the animal's legs in slow spirals that caught the morning light, and when he stopped, it wasn't with a flourish or a command, just a quiet halt that seemed to pull the entire street into stillness with him. Caleb Thornfield swung down from the saddle like a man who had all the time in the world, boots landing soft. Despite the weight of them, his hat casting a shadow that hid his eyes for a moment longer than it should have, and no one spoke his name, but they all knew it, the way people know a storm before it breaks, not by sight, but by the way the air changes. He didn't look at the rope first, or the sheriff, or even the men who had set this all in motion. He looked at her, just once, just enough to see what the rest of them had refused to see, and then he turned his head slightly, taking in the circle, the silence, the expectation hanging thick as heat, and when he finally spoke, his voice didn't rise, didn't cut, didn't need to. because in a place like this, the quietest words carried the farthest. The words settled over the street like dust that refused to fall, and for a moment no one moved, not because they understood what he meant, but because they felt the weight behind it, the kind of weight that came from a man who did not waste breath on things he did not intend to carry through. And Caleb Thornfield stood there with his hands resting easy at his sides, not near his gun, not raised in challenge, just present in a way that made the space around him shift, as if the ground itself had decided to listen. Sheriff Brennan cleared his throat, a dry sound that broke too quickly, his fingers brushing the edge of his badge before dropping again. And when he spoke, his voice came out thinner than he expected, as though it had to travel farther than usual to reach the ears around him. "This does not concern you, Thornfield," he said, but the words lacked conviction, and everyone heard it. Even the boy at the front who tilted his head slightly, as if something in the world had just moved out of place. Caleb did not look at the sheriff right away. He let the silence stretch, let the heat press in, let the crowd sit with their own certainty for a second longer, and then he shifted his gaze, slow and deliberate, until it settled on Brennan, and when he spoke again, it was not louder, just clearer, like water running over stone. "Everything that happens in this street concerns me," he said, and the way he said it did not sound like a claim. It sounded like a fact that had always been there, waiting for someone to notice. A murmur rippled through the edges of the crowd, low and uncertain, the kind of sound people make when they are not ready to disagree, but no longer comfortable agreeing. And Marshall Creed stepped forward, boots heavy, shoulders squared in a way that tried too hard, his jaw set like he had practiced this moment in his head before it arrived. "You do not get to walk in here and tell us how to handle our problems," he said, and he pointed, not at Caleb, but at the girl, as if she were the problem itself. "She was found near the Miller Ranch before sunrise," he continued, voice rising just enough to gather support. "And you know what happened there last night. Everyone knows," and the words hung in the air like they were meant to fill in details that no one had actually seen. Caleb listened without interruption, his eyes never leaving the man speaking. And then he glanced once toward Ayanna, just once, and something in that look did not ask for permission or offer comfort. It acknowledged, and that was different. That was something the crowd did not know how to measure. Ayanna remained still, her breathing slow, her posture unbroken despite the rope at her wrists, and there was a quiet in her that did not come from fear. It came from knowing that whatever was said next would not change what had already been decided, unless something stronger than words stepped into the space between them. "What did you see?" Caleb asked, turning back to Creed, and the question was simple. So simple it almost sounded misplaced, but it cut through the noise in a way that forced an answer. Creed hesitated, just a fraction, and then he waved a hand toward the edge of town, towards something unseen, something already turned into a story before anyone bothered to look closer. "We saw enough," he said, and a few heads nodded, quick, eager, like agreement could make the answer more solid than it was. Caleb took one step forward, not fast, not threatening, just enough to close the distance by a few feet, and the movement drew every eye, not because it was sudden, but because it was certain. "Enough is not a thing you can measure," he said, and now his voice carried just a little farther, not louder, but steadier, like it had found its place in the air. "You either saw her do something, or you did not." The wind picked up slightly, brushing against coats and skirts, lifting a thin veil of dust that drifted between them, and for a second it blurred the lines, softened the edges, made everyone look less sure of where they stood. A man near the back shifted, clearing his throat, and spoke without meaning to draw attention, but the silence pulled his words forward anyway. "No one saw her do it," he admitted, and as soon as he said it, he looked down, like the truth had weight he was not ready to carry in front of the others. The boy looked up again, this time not at his mother, but at the girl, and then at Caleb, and something in his expression changed, not understanding, not yet, but the beginning of it, the small crack where doubt could grow if it was given time. Sheriff Brennan exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping just enough to be noticed, and he took a half step forward, then stopped, caught between the man he had been expected to be and the man he knew he should have been, and that space held him tighter than any rope could. Caleb let the moment sit, let the admission settle into the ground beneath their feet, and then he spoke again, softer now, but somehow carrying even farther than before. Then what you have is not justice, he said, and he did not point, did not accuse, just stated it like he was naming something already present. What you have is a story you told yourselves because it was easier than asking one more question. No one answered, not because they could not, but because answering would mean choosing, and choosing would mean standing alone for a second, and that was something this town had not done in a long time. Ayanna lifted her gaze slightly, not toward the crowd, not toward the rope, but toward the horizon beyond the buildings, where the land stretched out wide and open, and for the first time since they had brought her here, there was something in her eyes that shifted, not hope, not yet, but the recognition that something had entered the story that did not belong to the ending they had written for her. The silence did not break all at once. It thinned, like ice under slow pressure, and you could feel it in the way boots shifted again, in the way people glanced at one another not for agreement, but for reassurance, because something had entered the street that did not follow the rules they were used to, and when rules change, even a crowd begins to feel small. Marshal Creed drew in a breath like he meant to steady the ground beneath him, but his eyes flickered once toward the others, and that was enough to show where his strength came from, not from certainty, but from numbers. You think you can walk in here and turn this around with a few words, he said, and his voice carried sharper now, like he was trying to reclaim something slipping through his fingers, but there was a strain in it, something stretched too tight. Caleb did not answer right away. He let the man hear his own words settle into the dust, let them sit there without support, and then he tilted his head slightly, studying Creed the way a man studies weather before deciding which way to ride. I am not turning anything, he said, calm, even, the kind of tone that did not argue, it revealed. I am asking what you are standing on. That question did not land like the others. It did not invite a quick answer or a louder voice. It sat heavier, because it pointed at something deeper than the story, something beneath it, and for a second, Creed had nothing to say. The woman with the shawl tightened her grip again, but this time it was not against the girl, it was against the space around her, like she was holding on to something that had begun to move. Sheriff Brennan shifted once more, his boots grinding lightly against the dirt, and he took a full step forward this time. Not much, maybe 2 feet, but in a place like this, that distance carried weight. There was trouble at the Miller Ranch, he said, slower now, as if choosing each word carefully for the first time that morning. Things missing, signs of someone passing through, and she was found near the edge of the property, and he stopped there, because that was all he had, and everyone heard it for what it was, not a conclusion, just a collection of pieces that had been forced into one. Caleb nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, and then he reached slowly into the inside pocket of his coat, not quick enough to startle, not slow enough to be uncertain, just deliberate, and every eye followed the movement. Not because they expected danger, but because they did not know what it meant yet, and in that moment, not knowing was louder than any shout. When his hand came out, it held something small, something that caught the light just enough to be seen, a thin strip of leather with a piece of turquoise set into it, worn smooth by time, the edges darkened by years of use, and he held it between his fingers like it carried more weight than it should. This was found half a mile east of the Miller place, he said, and his voice did not rise, but it reached every corner of the street, and I picked it up before sunrise. The object seemed too small to matter in a moment like this. But that was the way of things out here. The smallest pieces often carried the truth the loudest voices tried to bury. Ayanna's gaze shifted, just slightly, and for the first time, there was recognition there. Not surprise, not fear, something steadier, like a memory surfacing through still water. Creed frowned, his brow tightening as he stepped closer, eyes fixed on the item as if he could force it into meaning that suited him. That does not prove anything, he said quickly, too quickly, and the speed of it made a few heads turn. No, Caleb agreed, and the word came easy, without resistance, which made the next part land harder. It does not prove what you want it to. He turned the strip of leather slightly, letting the light catch the markings along its edge, faint, nearly worn away, but still there if you knew how to look. This is not something taken, he continued. This is something given, and he paused, just long enough for the idea to settle into the space between them, and then he added, and it was given to someone who does not belong to your ranch or your town. A murmur moved through the crowd again. Softer now, uncertain, like a wind that had lost its direction, and the boy stepped a little closer to his mother, not out of fear, but because something in him wanted to see better, to understand more, and that small movement went unnoticed by most, but not by Caleb. Sheriff Brennan's eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in thought, the kind that comes when a man begins to see the gap between what he was told and what stands in front of him. And he took another step, this time not stopping halfway. "Where did you find it exactly?" he asked, and his voice had changed, not stronger, but clearer, like it had finally decided which side of the line it stood on. Caleb met his gaze without hesitation. "On a trail that leads away from the Miller place," he said, "not toward it." And the words did not need emphasis, because their meaning carried on their own. The shift was not loud. It did not come with gasps or raised voices. It came in the way shoulders lowered, in the way eyes moved, in the way certainty loosened its grip just enough to let doubt breathe. And in the center of it all, Ayanna stood as she had from the beginning. But now the space around her had changed, not because she had moved, but because the ground beneath everyone else had begun to shift. The shift did not announce itself. It settled into the bones of the street, quiet and persistent, and the crowd felt it before they understood it, the way a man feels a storm coming long before the clouds gather. And suddenly the space between people widened by an inch, then another, not enough to notice outright, but enough to break the tight circle that had held so firm just moments ago. Marshall Creed saw it too, and that was what unsettled him most. Not the words, not the leather strip, but the way the others were no longer standing as close as they had been, no longer leaning forward with the same certainty, and he stepped in again, faster this time, trying to pull the moment back under his control before it slipped too far. "That could have been dropped there by anyone," he said, his voice sharper, reaching now instead of resting, and he pointed toward the ground as if the direction alone could give his claim weight. "And you expect us to believe she just happened to be walking away from the place when trouble was found there? You expect us to ignore what we already know?" Caleb did not move, not even a shift of his shoulders, but his eyes followed the man's gesture, then returned to his face, steady, unhurried, and when he answered, it was with the same calm that had been there from the beginning, the kind that did not rise to meet tension. It let tension exhaust itself. "I expect you to look at what is in front of you," he said, "and not what you decided before you got here." The words did not strike like a challenge, they settled like a weight, and for a second, Creed had to hold himself upright against them. Sheriff Brennan stepped closer again, now within arm's reach of Caleb, and he looked down at the leather strip, his brow furrowed as if he were trying to remember something he had once known but let slip away over time. "That marking," he said slowly, pointing not to the stone, but to the faint lines along the edge. "I have seen that before," and his voice carried something new now, not doubt, not yet certainty, but recognition, the first true crack in the story they had built. Caleb did not answer. He simply turned the strip slightly, letting Brennan see it more clearly, and the sheriff leaned in, his eyes narrowing as the memory found its way back. "It belongs to the Red Mesa tribe," Brennan said, almost to himself. "They trade these along the northern trail." And he paused, then looked up, his gaze shifting from the object to the girl standing bound in the center of the street, and something in his expression changed, not fully, but enough. "That trail does not pass near the Miller Ranch," he added, and this time the words were not for himself, they were for everyone. The murmurs grew again, but they no longer carried the same edge, they sounded uncertain now, questioning. And a man near the back shook his head slowly, as if trying to push away a thought that had already taken root. Creed turned sharply, his jaw tightening as he scanned the faces around him, searching for the agreement that had been so easy just minutes before. But what he found instead were eyes that no longer met his, shoulders that no longer leaned in his direction, and that was the beginning of the end for any man who relied on others to hold his ground. "You are letting him twist this," he said, louder now, but the volume did not bring the crowd back. It only made the distance clearer. "You are forgetting what kind of people we are dealing with." And there it was again, not evidence, not fact, just the same old line dressed in urgency, and this time it did not land the way it had before. Caleb's gaze moved across the crowd, not lingering on any one face, but taking them all in, and when he spoke, it was not to Creed, it was to the space between them all. You do not need to forget anything, he said. You just need to remember what matters. And he let that sit for a second, long enough for the words to find their way into places that had been closed off. Then he added, you said there was trouble at the ranch, things missing, signs of someone passing through. And he looked back at Brennan, not accusing, not pressing, just connecting the pieces. What direction did those signs point? Brennan hesitated, just briefly, but it was enough to show the shift inside him. And then he answered, slower now, like a man stepping carefully across ground that might not hold, west, toward the dry ridge. Caleb nodded once, and that small motion seemed to settle something in the air. The Red Mesa Trail runs east, he said, and the difference between those two directions hung there like a line drawn in the dirt, clear and undeniable. The boy at the front looked from one man to the other, then back at the girl, and this time there was no confusion in his eyes, only a quiet realization that what he had been told did not match what he was hearing now. The woman beside him loosened her grip on his shoulder without noticing, her hand falling to her side as her gaze drifted away from the center of the street, as if she could no longer hold it there. Ayanna remained still, but her breathing had changed, not faster, not slower, just different, as if the weight pressing against her had shifted just enough to let air move more freely. And when her eyes lifted again, they did not search the crowd. They rested briefly on Caleb, not in gratitude, not yet, but in recognition of something rare, something she had not expected to find here. The rope still hung where it had been placed, the beam still stood, the dust still moved with the wind, but the meaning of it all had begun to change, not because anything physical had been removed, but because the certainty that held it together was no longer whole. And in a place like this, that was all it took for everything else to follow. The line between belief and doubt did not snap. It stretched, thin as a thread pulled too far, and every man and woman standing in that street could feel it pressing against something inside them they had not planned to examine that morning. Because it is one thing to follow a crowd, and another to realize the ground beneath that crowd is no longer steady. Marshall Creed took a step back without meaning to, just half a foot. But it was enough. Enough for the man beside him to notice, enough for the shape of the circle to loosen further, and he caught himself quickly, drawing his shoulders up as if posture alone could restore what had slipped. You are all letting this get away from you, he said, his voice louder now, sharper, but there was a crack in it that had not been there before, a strain that came from pushing against something that no longer gave way as easily. This is how it starts, he went on, grasping for something familiar, something that had worked before. You start asking questions, and next thing you know, you have forgotten who you are dealing with, and the words echoed, but they did not land the same. They hovered, searching for a place to settle, and finding less and less with each passing second. Caleb did not respond to the volume. He did not match it. He did not rise to it. He let it pass over him like wind over rock, and when it was gone, he spoke again, quieter than before, but somehow carrying farther than anything that had been said yet. Then answer one more question, he said, and this time he did not look at Creed. He looked at the sheriff, because that was where the line would be drawn, not by the loudest voice, but by the one with the responsibility to stand when others would not. Brennan met his gaze, and for the first time since the morning began, he did not look away. If she came from the east, Caleb continued, and the trouble was to the west, then what brought her here, into the middle of your town, in daylight, with nothing to hide? And he let the question sit, not demanding, not accusing, just present, and that presence was heavier than any force. Brennan exhaled slowly, the kind of breath a man takes when he knows the next words matter more than the ones that came before, and he turned, not to Caleb, not to Creed, but to the crowd, because that was where the answer needed to land. We did not ask that, he said, and the admission was simple, almost plain, but it carried through the street like a bell, clear and impossible to ignore. No one argued, no one interrupted, because there was nothing to argue with, and that was the moment something shifted fully, not halfway, not uncertain, but enough that the story they had built no longer held together the way it had before. A man near the beam glanced up at the rope, then back at the others, and his hands dropped to his sides without him noticing, as if the purpose he had held onto had quietly slipped away. The woman with the shawl took a step back, just one, but it placed her behind the line she had stood on all morning, and she did not step forward again. The boy looked at the girl once more, but this time he did not see a stranger. He saw a person standing where no one should have been made to stand without reason, and that difference, small as it was, settled into him like something that would stay. Ayana's shoulders remained straight, her hands still bound, but the weight around her had changed, not lifted, not gone, but altered, as if the air itself had made room where before it had pressed in from all sides. And when she looked out now, she did not see a wall, she saw spaces between people, and through those spaces, something beyond them. Marshal Creed saw it too, and that was what drove him forward again, not confidence, but the need to stop what he could not control, and he moved closer to Brennan, his voice lower now, urgent in a different way, as if he were trying to pull the sheriff back before it was too late. "You know what happens if we let this go," he said, not loud enough for everyone, but loud enough for those nearest to hear. "You know what kind of message that sends." And there it was again, not truth, not evidence, just fear, shaped into something that sounded like reason. Brennan did not answer right away. He stood there, looking at the girl, at the rope, at the men and women who had trusted him to make this simple, to make it easy, and for the first time, he seemed to understand that it was neither. Caleb watched without moving, without pressing, because he knew this part did not belong to him. It belonged to the man wearing the badge, and the street held its breath in a way that felt different now, not eager, not waiting for a spectacle, but waiting for a choice. The wind shifted again, carrying dust across the ground in a slow line that passed between Caleb and Ayana, between Brennan and Creed, drawing a quiet boundary no one had marked, but everyone could feel. And when Brennan finally spoke, his voice was not loud, but it was steady in a way it had not been all morning. "We do not decide a thing like this without knowing," he said, and the words settled into the space with a kind of finality that did not shout, did not demand, but simply stood, and for a moment, no one moved at all, because in a place where decisions had been made quickly and loudly, a quiet decision carried more weight than anyone was prepared for. The words did not echo, they settled, and in that settling the entire street seemed to lean into something quieter, something heavier, because a decision made without shouting carried a kind of weight no one could easily push aside, and for a long second, no one knew what to do with it. Marshal Creed stared at Brennan as if the man had just stepped out of line in a way that could not be undone, his jaw tightening, his breath slow and controlled, but his eyes gave him away. They moved too quickly, searching for someone, anyone, who would still stand with him the way they had before, and what he found instead were faces turned inward, men and women looking not at him, not at the girl, but at the ground between their boots like it might hold an answer they had missed. "You are making a mistake," Creed said, but the force had drained from it, the words falling short of where they were meant to land, because a warning without belief behind it is just sound, and sound does not hold a crowd together. Brennan did not respond right away. He let the silence remain, and in that silence something else began to surface, not from the center of the street, but from its edges, from the places people had not thought to look when everything seemed certain. A man near the hitching post cleared his throat, hesitant, unsure if he should speak at all, and when no one stopped him, he took a step forward, hat in his hands, turning it slowly as if the motion might steady his thoughts. "I was out by the East Ridge this morning," he said, his voice low but carrying in the quiet, checking fence lines, "and I saw tracks, fresh ones, heading toward the river bend," and he paused, glancing at the others like he expected to be corrected, but no one spoke, so he went on. "They were not hers, too deep, too wide, like a heavy horse pushing hard, and they were going away from the Miller place, not toward it." The words did not arrive with force, but they landed clean, and you could feel the shift ripple outward again, slower this time, deeper, because it was no longer just one man speaking against the crowd. It was another voice, unplanned, unforced, stepping into the space that had opened. Creed turned sharply toward him, his expression tightening, trying to catch the thread before it unraveled further. "You are guessing," he said, quick, almost desperate, trying to push the words back into uncertainty. "Tracks do not tell you who was there or why." The man nodded once, not arguing, just acknowledging, but he did not step back, and that alone said more than any reply. "No," he said, "they do not, but they tell you direction, and this was not hers." And he glanced, just briefly, toward Ayanna, not accusing, not defending, simply placing her within the truth as he had seen it. Caleb remained where he was, still as before, but his presence seemed to hold the moment steady, not pushing it, not guiding it, just allowing it to unfold without interference, the way a man lets a river find its own course once the obstruction is gone. Brennan turned toward the speaker, his brow furrowed, his mind working through the pieces now not as a story told to him, but as something he had to assemble himself, and he nodded slowly, once, then again, as if confirming something he had been reluctant to see. And no one followed those tracks, he said, not to the man, not to anyone, but the question was there all the same, hanging in the air. No one answered, because the answer was already clear. They had not looked, they had not asked, they had chosen a direction before the ground had given them one. Ayanna's gaze shifted again, not toward the crowd this time, but toward the edge of town, where the land stretched out into open distance, and there was something in the way she held that gaze, something that suggested she had come from that direction with purpose, not by accident. And for the first time, the question of why she was here began to take shape in the minds of those watching. The boy stepped forward without realizing it, just one small step, but it brought him closer to the center than he had been all morning, and his eyes moved between the men speaking, then to the girl, and back again, as if trying to place himself somewhere between what he had been told and what he was now hearing. Brennan straightened slightly, his shoulders settling into something firmer, not the uncertainty from before, but not the old confidence either, something different, something chosen rather than assumed. Then we are not done here, he said, and his voice carried farther now, not because it was louder, but because it no longer wavered. We are going to find out what happened, not decide it before we know. And the words moved through the street like a line drawn clean across uncertain ground. Creed opened his mouth to respond, but the moment passed him, the space that would have carried his voice no longer belonged to him, and he stood there, caught between what had been and what was becoming, his certainty slipping through his grasp like dry sand. Caleb finally shifted his weight slightly, just enough to break the stillness around him, and his eyes moved once more to Ayanna, and in that brief glance there was no question, no doubt, just acknowledgement, as if to say that the story had not ended where they had intended, and now it would have to find its own way forward. The rope still hung, the beam still stood, but neither held the same meaning now, and the town of Red Hollow, for the first time that morning, no longer felt certain of what it had almost done. The town did not move forward all at once. It shifted in pieces, like a wagon while trying to turn after being stuck too long in the same rut, and every man and woman standing there could feel that resistance, that pull between what they had been ready to do and what they were now being forced to reconsider. Sheriff Brennan stepped toward the center, not quickly, not with authority borrowed from the badge alone, but with something steadier, something earned in the last few minutes. And as he moved, the crowd gave way without being told, not out of fear, but because the space no longer belonged to them the way it had before. "Cut her loose," he said, and the words did not rise, they settled, and that made them harder to ignore. For a second, no one moved, not because they had not heard him, but because they needed to decide if they were still the same people they had been when the morning began, and then the man nearest the rope reached forward, slow, uncertain, his fingers working at the knot like he was undoing more than just a piece of cord. Ayanna did not flinch, did not step back. She stood as she had from the beginning, and when the tension at her wrists eased, her hands lowered slightly, not in relief, not in weakness, just in quiet acknowledgement that something had changed around her, not because she had asked for it, but because it had finally been allowed. Marshal Creed watched it happen with a stillness that did not belong to calm, his jaw set, his eyes fixed, and when he spoke again, his voice came low, tight, controlled in a way that carried more strain than any shout. "You are letting her walk," he said, and he did not look at Brennan. He looked at the others, because that was where his strength had always come from. "You are letting this go without consequence." Brennan turned toward him, not sharply, not defensively, just directly, and for the first time, there was no hesitation in his posture. "We are letting truth come before consequence," he said, and the difference between those two things hung in the air like a line no one had named before. Creed took a step forward, but it was not the same step as before, It did not pull the crowd with it. It did not gather support. It stood alone, and that was something he had not had to face until now. Caleb remained just off to the side, not stepping in, not speaking, because this part did not belong to him anymore. It belonged to the town itself, and the way they chose to stand or step back would define more than just this moment. A horse shifted somewhere behind the line of people, leather creaking softly, and the sound carried through the quiet like a reminder that the world beyond this street still moved, still waited, and what they decided here would follow them out there whether they wanted it to or not. The man who had spoken about the tracks stepped closer now, not to Caleb, not to Brennan, but to the space where Ayanna stood, and he did not look at her directly, not out of shame, not yet, but out of something quieter, something that had begun to take shape in him without a name. If those tracks were heading to the river bend, he said, then whoever passed through there would have needed to cross the old ford, and he glanced toward Brennan, his voice steadier now. We could still follow that trail. It has not been long. Brennan nodded once, and that single motion seemed to gather the remaining pieces of the moment into something solid. Then that is what we do, he said, and he turned slightly, addressing not just one man, but all of them. We find what is out there before we decide what belongs here. The boy stepped another inch forward, just enough, that he now stood clear of the line he had been behind all morning, and he looked at Ayanna, really looked this time, not through the lens of what he had been told, but as she was, standing in the same sun, breathing the same air, and something in his expression settled into quiet understanding that would stay with him long after the dust of this day had faded. Ayanna flexed her hands once, slow, deliberate, as if reminding herself of their freedom, and then she lifted her gaze again, not to the rope, not to the beam, but to the people, and there was no anger there, no demand, just a steady presence that did not ask for apology or explanation, because it did not need either to remain whole. Marshall Creed looked around once more, searching for something that would give him ground to stand on, but the street had changed, the faces had shifted, and the certainty he had carried into the morning had nowhere left to land, and for the first time, he seemed smaller, not in stature, but in presence, like a man who had been speaking loudly in a room that had quietly emptied. Caleb finally moved, just a step, turning toward his horse, his hand brushing lightly against the saddle as if the moment had already passed for him. But before he mounted, he paused, glancing once more toward Brennan, and there was something in that look, not approval, not judgment, just acknowledgement that a choice had been made where none had been expected. Brennan met it with a slight nod, almost imperceptible, but enough to mark the difference between the man he had been at dawn and the one standing there now. The rope swayed slightly in the light breeze, empty, its purpose undone not by force, but by something quieter, something harder to name, and as the crowd began to thin, not all at once, but in ones and twos, stepping back into doorways, onto porches, into the spaces they had come from, the street of Red Hollow returned to what it had always been, just a stretch of dust between buildings, carrying the weight of what had almost happened, and the quiet knowledge of what had been chosen instead. By late afternoon, the sun had climbed high enough to bleach the color from the street, turning everything into shades of dust and light, and the town that had gathered in judgment now moved in a different rhythm, slower, quieter, as if each step carried a question that had not been there before. Sheriff Brennan rode out first with 2 men, following the direction spoken aloud, west toward the dry ridge and the river bend beyond it, and they did not ride fast, not like men chasing guilt, but steady, like men searching for something they were no longer certain they would find where they had been told to look. The rest of the town did not return to normal, not fully, not yet, because something had shifted in the way people looked at one another, in the way conversations started and stopped, in the way silence lingered longer than usual between words. Caleb Thornfield had not left immediately, though it would have been easy for him to do so, to mount his horse and disappear into the same horizon he had come from. But instead he remained at the edge of the street, leaning lightly against the rail outside the general store, his hat low, his gaze distant, as if he were watching something unfold that no one else could see yet. Ayanna stood a few yards away, no longer bound, no longer held in place, but not moving either, not rushing to leave, not seeking distance, just standing in the open space where she had been placed, as if the ground itself still held the memory of what had nearly been decided upon it. A breeze passed through, light but constant, lifting strands of her dark hair, carrying with it the scent of dry earth and distant water, and for a moment, the entire street seemed suspended between what it had been and what it might become. Hours later, when the riders returned, it was not with urgency, not with noise, but with a quiet that spread ahead of them like a shadow, and the people who had drifted back into their homes and doorways stepped out again, drawn not by curiosity this time, but by something deeper, something that needed to be settled. Brennan dismounted slowly, his boots touching the ground with a weight that came not from distance traveled, but from what he carried back with him, and he did not speak right away. He let the silence gather, let the town lean in without being called. What we found was not what we were told, he said finally, and his voice carried clearly across the open space, not raised, not forced, just steady in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. There were tracks, as was said, he continued, but they belonged to two riders, not one, and they led west toward the ridge, then down toward the river, and he paused, glancing once at the faces in front of him, not searching for reaction, just letting the truth find its place. We followed them to the bend, and there we found what had been taken from the Miller place, hidden beneath brush, not far from the water. A murmur moved through the crowd again, but it was different now, softer, more restrained, like a sound people made when something they had believed began to loosen its hold. And we found something else, Brennan added, and this time his eyes shifted briefly toward Marshall Creed, not accusing, not dramatic, just placing the fact where it belonged. A second set of tracks, he said, turning slightly so all could hear, leading back toward town, but not from the direction she came, and he did not need to finish the thought, because the meaning settled on its own. Creed stood still, his posture rigid, his face unreadable at first, but the tension in his jaw, the way his hands hung at his sides without purpose, spoke louder than anything he could have said, and for the first time that day, he did not try to speak over the moment, did not try to shape it, because there was nothing left for him to hold on to. The town absorbed the words slowly, not all at once, but in pieces, in glances exchanged, in shoulders lowering, in the quiet realization that what had nearly been done could not be undone by explanation alone. Ayanna listened without moving, her expression unchanged, but there was something in her stillness that carried more weight now, not because she had been proven right, but because she had never needed to be proven at all. The truth had simply needed time to arrive. Caleb straightened from where he leaned, his gaze shifting once toward Brennan, then toward the horizon beyond the buildings. And there was no satisfaction in his posture, no triumph, just a quiet acknowledgement that something had unfolded the way it should have, even if it had nearly gone another way. The boy stood near the front again, his eyes fixed on the ground for a moment before lifting toward Ayanna, and when he looked at her this time, there was no fear, no confusion, just a quiet understanding that would follow him long after the dust settled. Brennan took a step back, his shoulders easing slightly, as if the weight he had carried into the street that morning had shifted into something else, something he would have to carry forward in a different way. And when he spoke again, it was not to the crowd, not to Creed, but to the space itself. "We were wrong to decide before we knew," he said, and the words did not come easy, but they came, and that was enough. The rope still hung where it had been left, untouched now, its presence no longer a threat, but a reminder, and as the sun began its slow descent, casting longer shadows across the street, the town of Red Hollow stood quieter than it had that morning, not because something had been taken from it, but because something had been revealed that could not be unseen. Evening came slow to Red Hollow, not with a sudden drop in light, but with a long stretch of shadows that pulled across the street inch by inch, softening edges, quieting colors, and giving the town time to sit with what it had almost become. The rope was taken down before the sun touched the horizon, not with ceremony, not with words, just a man climbing the beam and untying the knot he had tied that morning, his hands slower now, more careful, as if the act itself carried meaning he had not understood before. No one watched him do it, not directly, but everyone knew it was happening, and that was enough. Ayanna moved at last when the light began to fade, not quickly, not as someone eager to leave, but with a steady pace that matched the rhythm she had held all day, her steps quiet against the dirt, her path leading not away from the town in haste, but through it, past the same faces that had stood in judgment, past the same doorways and windows. And as she passed, no one stopped her, no one spoke, but a few lowered their eyes, just slightly. Just enough to mark the difference between who they had been that morning and who they were now. The boy stood near the edge of the street, watching her approach, his hands at his sides, unsure of what to do with them. And when she came close, he hesitated, then lifted one hand in a small, uncertain gesture, not quite a wave, not quite an apology, but something honest, something unpracticed, and Ayanna paused for just a second, long enough to meet his eyes, long enough for him to understand that he had been seen. And then she continued on without a word, because some things did not need to be spoken to be carried forward. Sheriff Brennan remained near the center of the street long after the others had drifted away, his hat in his hands now instead of on his head, his gaze fixed on the ground where the circle had been drawn, and he stood there as the light changed, as the air cooled, as the sounds of the town returned in quieter forms, a door closing, a horse shifting in its stall, the faint clink of metal from the blacksmith's shed, and in all of it, there was a stillness that had not been there before, not empty, but reflective, like a man listening to his own thoughts for the first time in a long while. Marshal Creed had left before the riders returned, slipping away without announcement, his absence noted but not discussed, because there was nothing left to say about it that would change what had already been seen, and sometimes a man's silence tells more than his words ever could. Caleb Thornfield mounted his horse as the last light stretched across the rooftops, his movements the same as they had been when he arrived, unhurried, deliberate, as if time moved differently for him than it did for others. And before he turned toward the open land beyond the town, he glanced once more toward the street, not searching, not checking, just acknowledging what had taken place. And then his eyes found Brennan, and for a moment, the two men held that look, not as strangers, not as allies, but as two men who had stood on different sides of the same moment and chosen, in the end, to step toward the same line. Brennan gave a slight nod, not formal, not forced, just enough to mark the understanding between them, and Caleb returned it in kind before guiding his horse forward. The sound of hooves steady and soft as he rode out of Red Hollow the same way he had entered, without announcement, without demand, leaving behind nothing but the space he had held when it mattered. The town settled into night slowly, lamps lighting one by one, casting warm glows through windows that had earlier framed something colder. And as people moved inside, as voices lowered, as the day folded into memory, there was a quiet awareness that would not leave with the dark, something that would remain in the way they spoke, in the way they paused before deciding, in the way they looked at someone different from themselves and chose, perhaps, to ask one more question before drawing a line. Out here, the land did not change for anyone. The wind still moved across the same miles of open ground. The sun still rose and fell without asking who deserved what. But in that small stretch of street, something had shifted that no storm could undo, something that did not need to be named to be real. Ayanna reached the edge of town just as the last light slipped below the horizon, and she did not look back, not because she had forgotten, but because she did not need to carry that place with her any longer. And as she stepped into the open land beyond, the darkness met her not as something to fear, but as something familiar, something honest. Behind her, Red Hollow stood quieter than it had the day before, not weaker, not broken, just changed. And sometimes that was the closest thing to justice a place like that would ever know, not in the sound of a gun, not in the force of a crowd, but in the silence that followed when a man chose to stand still instead of step forward with the rest.